Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about Commander on a budget. Today's episode is going to be a $25 deck tech. Decks on this channel are built to be fun, inexpensive, and focused. If you want to learn more about what a focused Commander deck is, check out this video here. On this deck tech, I'm going to take you through its strategy, the tactics, and how this deck wins. This show and episodes like this one are possible because of viewers like you. So if you're looking for some easy ways to help support the show, make sure you like this episode and share it with friends. And make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Another easy way to support this channel is by using our TCGPLAYER affiliate links. So make sure that you're looking for those links in the description whenever you're buying a deck or just individual cards. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Today's deck tech is on Yarok the Desecrated. With its current price, this is going to be a commander excluded deck tech. Yarok is a 3/5 elemental horror with death touch and lifelink that costs 2 black, green, blue. It says if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Basically, this is an improved Panharmonicon, but in your command zone. You can also look at it as a reverse Desecrated. Either way, this is a very unique commander with a very powerful effect. You can definitely take this commander in a lot of different directions. The direction that I wanted to take this commander was focusing around lands. There are plenty of great synergies within these colors when it comes to abusing landfall triggers. So what's our strategy with this deck? Well, we're going to double up on ETB and landfall triggers with our commander. Once we're set up, we're going to have a value engine going that's very hard for our opponents to stop. Ramping is already an extremely powerful thing in commander, and we're going to get even more value out of it. So how do we win with this deck? Well, we're going to overwhelm our opponents with our army, or we're going to combo off. We have plenty of ways with this deck to create a huge amount of tokens. We also have ways to pump our entire team and to make every single creature into a threat. And if we need to, we even have combos to kill all of our opponents at once. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to take you through 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how we're going to win with it. So let's start off with tactic number 1, land is life. First up, we've got Rampant Growth and Edge of Autumn, both of which let us search our library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. These are both fantastic ways to ramp early, and later in the game we can cycle away Edge of Autumn by sacrificing a land if we need to. Believe me, with this deck we're not going to be short on lands. Next up there's Harrow, which for the price of sacrificing one land we get 2 onto the battlefield untapped. It may only ramp us by 1, but this is a fantastic card in a deck centered around landfall. And then Grow from the Ashes can get us 1 or 2 lands if we kicked it. This is a very flexible card that can really help us out early or later in the game. And then there's Colony Heart Expedition, which can be especially effective in this deck. If our commander's in play, this is going to get 2 counters whenever a land comes into play. Once it gets its 3rd counter, we can take those off and sacrifice it to go get 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. This card not only benefits from our commander's effect, but it also enables our other effects too. But we've got plenty of other ways to ramp with this deck. Let's go through a different way in tactic number 2, Life on the Land. First up, there's Sky Shroud Ranger, Llanowar Scout, and Walking Atlas, each of which essentially do the exact same thing. We can tap them to put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield. Once we're set up, we can be drawing a lot of cards and have a decent amount of lands in our hand. These not only ramp us, but they can also enable some more landfall triggers. On top of that, there's even some combos that we can use with these creatures, but we'll get into those later. Next up is Badoka Gardener, which does the exact same thing, but if we control 10 or more lands, we have to flip Badoka Gardener. It flips into Dokai, Weaver of Life. We can pay 4 green to tap Dokai to create an XX green elemental creature token where X is the number of lands we control. So this card helps us ramp, potentially combo, and even create threats at a certain point. Finally, another creature that can help us ramp in a different way is Fertilid. Fertilid's going to enter the battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters on it. But if our commander's in play, we're going to get 4. And then we can pay 1 into green to remove a counter and search our library for basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. So at the very least, this gets us 2 lands and it can get us up to 4. And again, the more that we ramp, the more spells we can cast and the more landfall triggers we get. So that's why we're not quite done with ramping just yet. Let's go on to tactic number 3, Just Landed. First up, we've got Coiling Oracle, which when it enters the battlefield, we reveal the top card of our library. If it's a land card, it goes directly onto the battlefield, but if not, it goes into our hand. So this card essentially ramps us or draws us a card. And if our commander's in play, this becomes doubly effective. Ramping us by 2 lands or drawing us 2 cards for just 2 mana is huge. So we're going to be running even more creatures with ETBs that ramp us like Wood Elves, Yavimaya Dryad, and Yavimaya Granger. Wood Elves gets us a forest untapped. Yavimaya Dryad gets a forest tapped, and Yavimaya Granger gets us any basic land tapped. But again, if our commander's in play, we get double for each. And this is exactly where landfall is very effective with this commander. If our commander's in play, we get 2 lands with one of these, and that's 4 landfall triggers. This leads to some very explosive plays, but we'll get into those cards later. Next up, we've got Elvish Rejuvenator, and it has a similar effect. When it enters the battlefield, we look at the top 5 cards of our library and put a land from among them onto the battlefield tapped. With the number of lands that we're running in this deck, chances are pretty high we're going to hit a land each time. We're also going to be running some creatures that we usually wouldn't run in most decks. Quarian Trailblazer, Wild Wanderer, and Undew Giant are usually seen as suboptimal. Paying 4 mana to ramp by 1 land and get a creature is usually not good. But again, with Yarok out, we get 2 lands. And 2 lands for 4 mana is a pretty good rate. But then there's Springbloom Druid, which is easily the most effective out of all these creatures. It essentially is a Harrow on a body. When it comes into play, we have to sacrifice land, but we get to search for 2 lands and put them onto the battlefield. Now, unlike Harrow, these lands come into play tapped. That's a small price to pay though for this effect being on a body. Because with our commander in play, this triggers twice. So we sacrifice 2 lands and get 4 lands into play. That means that each landfall trigger that we have on the field triggers 8 times. That's an absolutely absurd amount of value for just 3 mana. But in order for this deck to be effective, we need to draw cards to keep things going. Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 4, Enter the Infinite. First up, we're running Elvish Visionary, Wall of Blossoms, and Fibbleflip the Lost. Each of these essentially do the exact same thing. They cost 2 mana, and when they enter the battlefield, we draw a card. Again, with our commander in play, that's 2 cards. And drawing 2 cards for 2 mana and getting a creature out of it is a very good rate. And we're also going to be running Dust Legion Zealot, which does the exact same thing, but it also loses us life. In this format, 1 life per card is a very small price that we're willing to pay. And then we're going to be running Gonti, Lord of Luxury. When Gonti enters the battlefield, we look at the top 4 cards of target opponent's library and we exile one of them face down. As long as that card is exiled, we can look at it and cast it with any kind of mana. Playing our opponent's cards can be very effective, especially when we get 2 of them. Next up, there's Regal Force, which can draw us a ton of cards at once. When it comes into play, we draw a card for each green creature we control. The vast majority of creatures in this deck are green. And even at the very least, just with our commander in play, this draws us 4 cards. But some even more explosive ways to draw cards with this deck come from Tatyova and Soul the Harvest. Tatyova says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Again, with all the lands that are going to be entering the battlefield under our control and all of our landfall triggers doubling, this can be huge. With our commander in play, just a Wood Elves is going to draw us 4 cards and gain us 4 life. And Springbloom Druid does it for 8. And then Soul the Harvest says, whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. We're going to have a ton of creatures coming into play, and this draws us 2 cards every single time one does. Both of these are fantastic value engines that can really put us way ahead of our opponents. But what's better than having 1 Soul the Harvest on the field? Let's go through that in tactic number 5, Twinning. First up, there's Mirror Image, which enters the battlefield as a copy of any creature that we control. Clones can be incredibly effective with this deck. If we need to ramp more, we can clone one of our ramp creatures. If we need to draw more cards, we can clone a Soul the Harvest or a Regal Force. Clones can essentially be a second copy of some of our best creatures. And with other clones like, well, Clone and Gigantoplasm, we can get copies of our opponent's best creatures too. And if one of those creatures has a great ETB, we get it twice. And then a card like Altered Ego is even more effective in this deck. First off, it can't be countered, which is fantastic, but it also comes into play with double the amount of counters on it. So we can get a ton of value out of this card, and it can be a huge threat. But the most effective out of these clones might be Vizier of Many Faces. It essentially can clone twice, since when it dies, we can embalm it. Creatures that clone are fantastic for this deck. But we even have some more ways to take advantage of the creatures that are already on the battlefield. Let's go through them now in tactic number 6, Don't Blink. First up, there's Essence Flux, which for just a blue is going to exile target creature we control and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. So for just 1 mana, we can get one of our creatures' ETBs again. If we're set up correctly, the amount of value that this can provide for just 1 mana is insane. We're also going to be running some blink effects that cost a little bit more but are still well worth it. Ghostly Flicker, Displace, and Illusion Stratagem can each blink 2 of our creatures. The best part about these is that we can use them for value and for saving our creatures too. With the amount of ramp that we have in this deck, it's going to be very easy for us to cast our commander most times, but it's even better if we can save it. And if we're set up properly, these cards can come out of absolutely nowhere and can really set us up for a huge turn. But we're not quite done with abusing ETBs just yet. So let's go through some more ways in tactic number 7, There and Gone. First up, we're going to be running Shrieking Drake and Dreamstalker, both of which essentially do the exact same thing for us. When they come into play, we're going to return one of our creatures back to our hand. This is a great effect because we can recast that creature and get its ETB again. But what makes these absolutely absurd with our commander is that we get 2 creatures back to our hand instead of 1. And one of the 2 creatures that it returns can be itself. So essentially we can just keep doing this over and over again until we run out of mana. So for example, we can cast Shrieking Drake and bring it and Wood Elves back to our hand. We cast the Wood Elves to ramp by 2. Then we cast Shrieking Drake to bring it back to our hand. Just that in itself can be very powerful. But it can be even more powerful with some value engines on the battlefield. And up next, we've got Mana War and Aether Depth, both of which can bounce any creature. Now these are slightly more expensive, but are well worth the effect. With our commander in play, we get to bounce any 2 creatures. Since they can bounce themselves, we essentially can just keep paying 3 mana to bounce any of our opponent's creatures. A more expensive but potentially even more effective card is Riftwing Cloudskate. When it comes into play, it bounces any permanent. When our commander doubles this, we can bounce itself back to our hand too. So for 5 mana, we can continue to bounce anything, including lands. These are great flexible cards that can help us out in a variety of situations. But what are some other ways that we can throw a wrench into our opponent's plans? Let's go through them now in tactic number 8, How About No? First up, we've got Negate and Unwind, both of which can counter non-creature spells, and Unwind even untaps 3 lands for us when we cast it. Next up, we're going to be running Reclamation Sage and Acidic Slime. When Rec Sage enters the battlefield, it's going to destroy target artifact or enchantment, and with our commander in play, this takes out 2. Acidic Slime does the exact same thing, but it can also take out lands. Resource Denial isn't the objective of this deck, but you can definitely do that with Acidic Slime. You can really shut an opponent out of the game if you blink it or if you cast it over and over again. Now, taking out all of our opponent's lands is one way to win, but we've got more effective ways than that. So let's go through some cards that help us get our finishers in tactic number 9, Lost and Found. First up, there's Phyrexian Delver, which is a fantastic card in this deck. When it comes into play, we return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield, and we lose life equal to that card's converted mana cost. With our commander in play, that's 2 creatures, and that life loss is well worth it. If we've got a key piece or 2 in the graveyard, this can help us get them back. And if there are some in our library, we can get them with Fierce Empath. When it comes into play, we can search for a creature with converted mana cost of 6 or greater and put it into our hand. And again, with our commander in play, that's 2 creatures. So we can go get something like Soul the Harvest or some of our finishers too. But then there's Wild Pair, which can get even more out of hand with this deck. It says whenever a creature enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, you may search your library for a creature card with the same total power and toughness and put it onto the battlefield. If you do, shuffle your library. This card leads to some absolutely insane turns. With our commander in play, this is going to trigger twice. The vast majority of our creatures have a very low total power and toughness. So if we cast something like a Wood Elves, we can go get a Shrieking Drake and a Fierce Empath and put them right into play. We get their ETBs and Shrieking Drake can bring it and something else back to our hand. We can just keep recasting the Drake and doubling this trigger over and over again. This gets us a ton of creatures into play for very little cost. This deck can definitely draw a ton of cards to get to what it needs, but tutoring is even more effective. Although this is a very powerful card, it can't always get us exactly what we need. And that's why, in my opinion, it's not quite good enough to be the Golden Pig. The Golden Pig is going to be the number 1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Shared Summons. Shared Summons is an instant that costs 3 green. It says search your library for up to 2 creature cards with different names, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. Now, a tutor that gets you 2 creatures for 5 mana is a pretty good value for any creature-based deck. But at instant speed in this deck, this card can just essentially win you the game out of nowhere. If you need to cast this early to get the pieces that you need for the situation that you're in, you can. But if your commander's already in play and your opponents can't stop it, they're going to be in big trouble. You cast this at instant speed right before your turn, and then you go off. So in order for me to show you how powerful this tutor is, I need to show you the cards it gets. So now it's time to move on to our final tactic. Tactic number 10, Despicable Desecration. So with Shared Summons, we go get Peregrine Drake and something like Mana War. The combo goes like this. We cast Peregrine Drake and it's going to untap 5 lands. Thanks to our commander, that's going to trigger twice. When the 5 lands untap the first time, we tap them for mana. When they untap the second time, we tap them again, so we've got 10 floating mana. With 3 of that mana, we cast Mana War. Mana War's ETB triggers twice and we target Peregrine Drake and Mana War itself. So at this point, we've got 7 mana remaining and we've got Peregrine Drake and Mana War back in our hand. We cast Peregrine Drake with 5 of that mana, so we've got 2 left. He untaps our lands twice again, putting us at 12 mana. With 3 of that mana, we cast Mana War, putting us back at 9. We bring these 2 creatures back to our hand again. Essentially, every single time this process is repeated, we gain 2 mana. So essentially, we have infinite mana. When that happens, we don't need Peregrine Drake anymore. We cast Mana War on its own to return it and another creature back to its owner's hand. If we really want to, we can bounce all of our opponent's creatures back to their hands, but that usually is not necessary. If we have any creatures on the battlefield that have a relevant ETB, we can use them as many times as we want. Because with our infinite mana, we can keep casting them and then Mana War to bring them both back to our hand. If that's an Elvish Visionary, we can essentially draw our entire deck. If it's Acidic Slime or Riftwing Cloudscape, we're essentially going to get rid of all of our opponent's permanents. If it's Fierce Empath, we can go search up the card that we need to win. We'll get into one of those here in a minute. And if it's Phyrexian Delver, we can get us back something that we need. And say we already had one of these pieces in our hand before we cast Shared Summons. Shared Summons is going to get us that 3rd piece that we need to finish our opponents off. But say that we don't have the pieces that we need to win right away. Even with just an Undo Giant in play, we go get all of our lands. We're going to get any landfall triggers that we might have. And even if we're not set up that way, we're going to have 40 lands in play and all of our opponent's creatures are going to be back to their hand. That easily sets us up to win in a future turn. But surprisingly, this isn't the only way that we can combo off. Now this second combo in the deck revolves around Retreat to Coral Helm. Now this is actually the same combo that's used in Tatiova. If you want to see an in-depth explanation of this combo, you can go check it out there. One key difference though is that with Yarok in play, you actually generate infinite mana. In the Tatiova combo, you put a bounce land back into play over and over again. With Yarok in play, you have to bounce another land back to your hand. Now that seems like a bad thing, but that's actually a good thing with this setup. You tap Walking Atlas to put the forest back into play. Coral Helm triggers, you untap Walking Atlas. You tap the forest for mana. You tap Walking Atlas again and put the bounce land back into play. Coral Helm triggers, it untaps the Walking Atlas. You do this over and over again, getting as many landfall triggers as you need, and you have infinite mana. And as long as you have one basic land of each type, you've got all of your colors too. With all those landfall triggers, if you've got Retreat to Hagra in play, you just win. Even without infinite triggers, this can still be effective throughout the game. Other great landfall triggers happen with token generation with Spore Mount, Zendikar's Royal, and Rampaging Balos. Again, you definitely don't need infinite triggers to win with these. With your commander in play, a simple creature like Wood Elves gets you 2 lands. Those 2 lands each trigger twice for each of these. So for Rampaging Balos, that's 16 power for just 3 mana. It doesn't take long for that to add up and just take over a game. You can also just take your opponent's creatures and win too. Royal Elemental can steal a ton of creatures for you when your lands come into play. And Agent of Treachery is pretty absurd in this deck. This is a creature I was talking about a little while back with Fierce Empath. When you've got the Peregrine Drake Mana War combo, Agent of Treachery becomes a win condition. When it comes into play, you steal a permanent. With your commander, you get 2. And again, even if you're not going infinite, you've got plenty of ways to abuse this. And on top of that, if you've stolen 3 permanents, it can even draw you cards. But even your smallest creatures can be a win condition too with Baru, Fist of Krosa, and Enraze Forerunners. Baru says, whenever a forest comes into play, green creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample until end of turn. And then when Enraze Forerunners enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain vigilance and trample until end of turn. Again, both of these double up with our commander, and this deck is extremely effective at getting lands and creatures into play. This deck can generate a ton of value and can be very hard for your opponents to stop. Yarok the Desecrated is definitely a very unique and powerful commander. But now that we've gone through the spells in this deck, let's go on to the mana base. First up, we're going to be running Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can sacrifice to search our library for basic land and put in play tapped. Next up, there's Blighted Woodland, which we can tap for a colorless, so we can pay 3 and a green to tap and sacrifice it for 2 basic lands. And then there's Opulent Palace, which enters the battlefield tapped and taps for any of our colors. Next up, we've got Foul Orchard, Golgari Guildgate, and Jungle Hollow, each of which enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either black or green. And then Simic Guildgate, Woodland Stream, and Thornwood Falls do the same thing. They each enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either green or blue. Next up, we're running the Vivid Lands, which come into play tapped with 2 charge counters on them. They can each tap for one of our colors, or we can remove a charge counter from them to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. And then we've got the Bounce Lands with Simic Growth Chamber, Golgari Rot Farm, and Dimir Aqueduct. Each enter tapped to make us return a land back to our hand, but they tap for 2 of our mana. And finally, we're going to be running 24 basic lands. 14 of those will be a forest, 8 will be islands, and 2 will be swamps. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Yarok EDHREC deck is going to set you back $451.13. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at $24.98. Again, a quick reminder that neither of these prices include the cost of the commander. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades now to see what some of those ways just might be. First up, let's add in Farhaven Elf and take out Query and Trailblazer. Costing 1 less, Farhaven Elf is just a strict upgrade. And then let's add in Risen Reef and take out Edge of Autumn. Risen Reef is essentially a coiling oracle with a lot of upside. Next up, let's put in Lotus Cobra and take out Dreamstalker. It can give us a ton of mana whenever our lands come into play. And then we're going to be adding in Venser, Shaper Savant, and taking out Retreat to Hagra. With Venser in our deck, we're going to use Shared Summons to get Peregrine Drake and it. Essentially, it's going to give us infinite mana and bounce every single one of our opponent's permanents. Up next, we're going to be adding in Deadeye Navigator and taking out Essence Flux. Deadeye Navigator is a fantastic, repeatable effect that really helps us abuse our ETB triggers even further. Finally, we're going to be adding in Spark Double and taking out Clone. With it in our commander in play, we get an incredible amount of triggers. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really want to hear about your thoughts on these picks, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. And make sure that you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, check out some of our other episodes on budget deck techs, Quest for Quarters episodes, Commander topics, and Creators Quarters. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.